There is a sentence, 12 words, that I think about more than almost anything I've ever read in financial history. It was spoken by Cornelius Vanderbilt, the most powerful railroad man in America. A man who understood, better than anyone alive, how money moved through infrastructure. He said this about a specific railroad project. Building railroads from nowhere to nowhere is not a legitimate business. He was right. And yet it happened anyway. And the financial structures invented to make it happen, to fund a railroad that Vanderbilt himself called illegitimate, became the template for how the entire modern debt market works. Bonds. Government-backed securities. The concept of underwriting. The idea that an investment bank could stand between a risky project and a skeptical public, absorb the first shock of failure, and sell confidence like a product. All of it traces back to a decade between 1862 and 1873. To a railroad. To a scandal. And to a single catastrophic collapse that nearly ended the American financial system, and instead rebuilt it from the ground up. This is that story. Before we get to the fraud, we need to understand the problem. Because the fraud only makes sense when you understand just how impossible the project was supposed to be. In 1862, Congress passed the Pacific Railroad Act. It authorized the construction of the first transcontinental railroad, a line stretching from the Missouri River all the way to the Pacific coast. Roughly 1,750 miles. Through desert. Through mountains. Through territory that most Americans had never seen and couldn't reliably map. And through land controlled by native nations who, with considerable justification, did not want a railroad carved through it. The federal government recognized immediately that private investors would not touch this on their own. So they offered something remarkable. For every mile of track completed, the railroad companies would receive federal bonds, government-backed loans, valued at between $16,000 and $48,000 per mile, depending on terrain. Flat prairie, $16,000. Foothills, $32,000. Mountains, $48,000. In addition to the bonds, the companies would receive land grants, 20 million acres of public land along the route, worth an estimated $50 to $100 million. It was, by any measure, an extraordinary offer. And still, initially, there were no subscribers. No investors stepped forward. Because the return wasn't in operating the railroad. There were no towns along the route. No freight. No passengers. The territory was, as one report bluntly noted, empty of any commerce from Nebraska to California. The money, if there was going to be any, had to come from somewhere else. Thomas Durant understood this immediately. He was the vice president of the newly chartered Union Pacific Railroad. A promoter, a schemer, and by his own admission, spoken openly, which is part of what makes him so strange, a man whose stated goal was to grab a wad from construction fees and get out. He wasn't hiding it. He knew the railroad itself would likely never turn a significant profit. But construction? That was a different story entirely. In 1864, Durant and a partner purchased a dormant financial firm called the Pennsylvania Fiscal Agency. They renamed it, taking the name from a prestigious French financial institution. Though it had no actual connection to it, they called it the Crédit Mobilier of America. The structure they built around it was elegant in the way that a trap is elegant. Here is how it worked. The Union Pacific Railroad needed a construction company to build the line. The Union Pacific hired Crédit Mobilier as that construction company. But Crédit Mobilier was owned by the same people who ran Union Pacific. They were, in effect, making contracts with themselves. Union Pacific paid Crédit Mobilier with government-issued bonds and private investor capital. Crédit Mobilier used those payments to buy Union Pacific stock and bonds at favorable prices, then sold them on the open market. The construction invoices were inflated, sometimes dramatically. The actual cost to build the railroad was estimated at around $50 million. Crédit Mobilier billed $94 million. The excess, roughly $44 million, was split among insiders. And to keep the whole structure from being investigated, approximately $9 million in discounted Crédit Mobilier stock was distributed to key members of Congress. The Vice President of the United States. The Speaker of the House. A future President of the United States. then serving as a congressman from Ohio named James Garfield. Senator after senator. The distribution was described with chilling directness by Congressman Oakes Ames, the Massachusetts representative who was also one of Crédit Mobilier's primary shareholders, as placing stock where it will do most good. This was not subtle. But it didn't need to be. In 1864, conflict of interest was, as one historian put it, still a primitive concept. There was no law that clearly prohibited what they were doing. And by the time anyone looked carefully, by the time a reporter at the New York Sun published a front-page expose in September 1872 under the headline, "The King of Frauds," the railroad was already built. Promontory Summit, Utah. May 10, 1869. The Golden Spike. The celebration. The photographs that appeared in every newspaper in the country. The railroad was complete. The money was gone. And the consequences were just beginning. To understand what came next, you need to understand one man. If Thomas Durant was the architect of the fraud, Jay Cooke was the architect of something larger, the American mass bond market. Before Cooke, government bonds were sold primarily to wealthy investors and financial institutions. When the Civil War began in 1861, the Union needed money on a scale that the existing system simply could not handle. Cooke's innovation was radical in its simplicity. He sold bonds to ordinary people. Farmers, shopkeepers, factory workers. Using a network of agents, small bankers, insurance salesmen, real estate brokers, spread across the country, coordinated by telegraph from his Philadelphia headquarters, Cooke marketed Union war bonds the way you might market a consumer product. With advertising. With pamphlets. With moral appeals. Buy a bond. Support the Union. Earn 6% interest, paid in gold. It worked. Cooke sold hundreds of millions of dollars in Union war bonds. He essentially invented the bond drive, a model that every major government since has copied. And in doing so, he also invented something else, the idea that ordinary Americans should be investors. That abstract financial instruments, paper promises from distant institutions, could be made to feel personal, trustworthy, patriotic. After the war, Cooke's firm was the most prestigious banking house in the country. And when the Northern Pacific Railroad, a second transcontinental line, this one running from the Great Lakes to Oregon, needed financing, they came to Jay Cooke. He accepted. And this is where Vanderbilt's warning becomes relevant. The Northern Pacific was building from nowhere to nowhere. The territory it crossed was not empty in the way boosters claimed. It was home to Lakota and Dakota nations who resisted the surveys with force, and whose resistance required military escort to manage. The terrain was brutal. Workers reported engines sinking into bogs at temperatures of -36 degrees Fahrenheit. Bridges washed out. Roadbeds collapsed. By spring of 1873, the railroad was paying its own workers not in currency, but in scrip, company-issued paper redeemable only against future wages. Cooke had already sold $100 million in Northern Pacific bonds. It wasn't enough. He had no buyers left. The bonds sat unsold in his own vaults, financed against his depositors' money. Meanwhile, the Crédit Mobilier scandal had broken in 1872. The public's trust in railroad securities had collapsed. European investors, who had, at various points, owned as much as 75% of some American railroads, were pulling back. A banking crisis in Vienna in May 1873 had triggered capital contraction across the continent. The money that Cooke needed to keep the Northern Pacific alive was not coming. On September 18, 1873, Jay Cooke and Company announced its suspension. The most trusted name in American finance. Gone. What happened next had never happened before. The New York Stock Exchange, founded in 1792, a fixture of American commercial life for 80 years, closed its doors. For 10 days. The first closure in its history. Speculators were squeezed by margin loan rates that climbed, in some cases, to 5% per day. Bank runs spread from New York to Washington to Philadelphia to Chicago to cities across the Midwest and South. The panic moved faster than anyone could contain it. President Grant and his Treasury Secretary rushed to inject liquidity by purchasing government bonds on the open market, A maneuver that would look remarkably familiar to anyone who watched the Federal Reserve in 2008 or 2020. It helped slow the collapse. It did not stop it. By the time the depression that followed, then called the Great Depression, a name it held until an even worse one arrived 60 years later, had run its course, the damage was staggering. More than 18,000 businesses had failed. Over 100 banks closed. Nearly a quarter of all American railroads declared bankruptcy. Unemployment reached 14% nationally. In New York City, it reached 25%. Civil War veterans who had survived 4 years of combat found themselves homeless, wandering between cities looking for work. This is where the words tramp and bum entered common American usage to describe the men left behind by the crash. And among the first institutions to collapse was one that history has largely forgotten: the Freedmen's Savings Bank. It had been established in 1865 to hold the savings of formerly enslaved Americans, people who had nothing, who were building something from zero, who had placed their trust in a federal institution. Henry Cook, J. Cook's brother, and the governor of Washington, D.C., had been lending the bank's capital to his brother's firm to keep it solvent. When J. Cook collapsed, the Freedmen's Bank collapsed with it. The first people to lose everything in the Panic of 1873 were people who could least afford to lose anything. This detail matters, not because it changes the financial history, but because it tells you something true about who bears the cost when financial structures fail. By 1872, the Crédit Mobilier scandal was public. Congressional committees convened. Testimony was taken. Names were named. Schuyler Colfax, Grant's vice president, a man who had just months earlier been discussed as a potential presidential candidate, was implicated. So was James Blaine, then Speaker of the House. So was future President James Garfield. So was vice presidential nominee Henry Wilson. The House investigated 13 congressmen. After months of hearings, 2 men were censured. Oaks Ames, for distributing stock to colleagues. James Brooks, a New York Democrat, for accepting it. Censured, the mildest form of congressional reprimand. Not expelled. Not prosecuted. Both men died within months of the censure, so the question of further accountability became moot. Everyone else walked. Grant won re-election in 1872, in the middle of the scandal. The government eventually sued Union Pacific for misappropriation of funds. The Supreme Court ruled that the suit couldn't proceed until the company's debt matured, in 1895, and by that point, concluded the government had no real cause for complaint. After all, as historians have noted with considerable dryness, the country did get a transcontinental railroad. Whether it was worth what was paid for it, financially, morally, in lives lost, is a question that has no clean answer. Here is the thing about the Panic of 1873 that most people miss. We remember the destruction, the bankruptcies, the unemployment, the Freedmen's Bank, but we forget what the crisis forced into existence. In 1875, 2 years after the panic, the American Bankers Association was founded. Bankers who had watched the system fail sought collective structure. State legislatures, flooded with municipal bond defaults, passed new laws restricting local debt issuance. Some states wrote debt limits directly into their constitutions. A market-wide demand emerged that any new bond issue must be accompanied by the opinion of qualified legal counsel, independent lawyers who could verify the bond's validity and the issuer's authority to issue it. This is where bond counsel originated. The legal profession that today employs thousands of attorneys across the country, that reviews every municipal bond issued in America, was born directly from the chaos of railroad bond defaults in the 1870s. And then, in 1913, when Congress introduced a permanent federal income tax, they made a decision that still shapes American finance today. They excluded municipal bond income from federal taxation, a decision that made tax-exempt bonds permanently attractive to high-income investors, a market that in 2020 was valued at roughly $4 trillion. Its roots, the railroad era. Let's step back, because the deeper story here isn't really about fraud. Fraud is the surface. The deeper story is about a financial template that was created in this era, and then repeated, refined, and institutionalized across the next 150 years. The template works like this. You have a project that is genuinely necessary or genuinely believed to be necessary. A railroad, a highway, a housing market, a technology sector. Private investors, left entirely to their own judgment, would not fund it. The risk is too high. The timeline is too long. The return is too uncertain. So the government enters. It provides guarantees, subsidies, or tax advantages that make the investment more attractive. Private capital follows the government signal. Investment banks position themselves between the project and the investors, earning fees for the act of translation, for making a complex, risky thing feel legible and safe. The project gets built. Sometimes it works. Sometimes it doesn't. And when it doesn't, the question of who absorbs the loss, the investors, the institution, the government, or the public, is answered not by any clear principle, but by whatever power relationships exist at the moment of collapse. In 1873, small investors and the Freedmen's Bank. In 2008, homeowners and taxpayers. The template isn't a conspiracy. It's a structure. And once you see it, you find it everywhere. Corporate bonds, the debt instruments that allow every major American company to borrow from the public, scaled up using the infrastructure, the legal frameworks, and the investor habits that railroad bonds created. Investment banking as a profession, the idea of a firm that stands between a borrower and the public, underwrites the risk, and earns a fee for the service, was formalized in this era. Even the instinct to sell bonds to ordinary people, to democratize debt investment, to make abstract financial instruments feel like participatory acts, that started with Jay Cooke selling war bonds to shopkeepers in 1862. The architecture of modern debt was not designed in a room by economists. It was improvised under pressure during a decade of war, industrialization, and collapse, and then codified by the crises that followed. Return to Vanderbilt's sentence. Building railroads from nowhere to nowhere is not a legitimate business. He meant it as a financial verdict. The Northern Pacific, in his judgment, would never generate enough revenue from operations to justify its construction cost. He was right. But here is the complication. The Northern Pacific was eventually completed, in 1883, under new management. It opened up the Pacific Northwest to settlement. It connected Portland and Seattle to the national rail network. Whether or not it was a legitimate business in Vanderbilt's narrow sense, it reshaped the geography of a continent. And this is the tension that runs through all of this history. The projects that most transform a society are often, by conventional financial logic, impossible to justify. The Transcontinental Railroad, the Interstate Highway System, the early Internet, the space program. None of these made financial sense by the standards used to evaluate a local grocery. All of them required government support. All of them attracted, along with genuine vision, a significant amount of people primarily interested in extracting wealth from the construction phase. Durant's phrase, "grab a wad from construction fees and get out," has echoed through every major infrastructure boom in American history. The names change. The structure remains. On May 10, 1869, a golden spike was driven into the ground at Promontory Summit, Utah. It connected the Central Pacific Railroad, built east from Sacramento by Chinese immigrant laborers working for wages that their white counterparts refused to accept, with the Union Pacific, built west from Omaha largely by Irish immigrant laborers, Civil War veterans, and formerly enslaved men. The moment was photographed. The telegraph transmitted the news within seconds. Cities across America celebrated. And the men who had actually built it, the men who had worked through mountain winters and desert summers, who had carved tunnels through granite with hand tools, who had died of accidents and disease in numbers that were never accurately recorded, received wages. Some of them decent, many of them not. The Crédit Mobilier insiders received fortunes. The investors who had bought Union Pacific bonds received, ultimately, very little. The government received a transcontinental railroad and spent the next 22 years in court trying to recover the money it had been overcharged for it. And the public received a template, a set of financial instruments, legal structures, and market habits that would shape how America borrowed money for the next century and a half. The bond market we inherited was not designed. It was improvised. under extraordinary pressure, by people with extraordinary self-interest. And it worked, insofar as things were built. And it failed, insofar as the costs were consistently borne by those with the least power to resist them. D-bond era. When you design a financial system, the incentives you build in will be followed. Not by villains uniquely. By almost everyone. The question is not whether people respond to incentives. They do. The question is what you're incentivizing. There is a section of the original transcontinental rail route that is still in use today. Upgraded, of course. Modernized. But the basic geography, the passes through the Sierra Nevada, the route across the Nevada desert, the path down through Utah, follows roughly the same line that was surveyed in the 1860s. The bonds that financed it are long since paid. Union Pacific paid off its government debt in full, eventually. So did the Central Pacific. The courts ruled that the government had no grounds for further complaint. The railroad exists. Cities grew around it. Industries organized around it. The financial structures invented to build it outlasted it. Bond markets. Investment banking. The underwriting model. Bond counsel. Tax-exempt municipal debt. The mass marketing of securities to ordinary people. These are not relics. They are the architecture of the financial world you live in today. Every municipal bond that builds a school in your city. Every treasury note that anchors the global reserve currency. Every corporate bond that allows a major employer to borrow at scale. Every investment bank that earns a fee for standing between a borrower and a nervous public. All of it runs on rails that were laid between 1862 and 1873. Not because those years were uniquely wise, but because they were uniquely pressured. And under pressure, humans improvise systems. And then the systems outlast the pressure that created them. Thomas Durant grabbed his wad and got out. Jay Cook went bankrupt and then got rich again in a Utah silver mine. James Garfield went on to be elected President of the United States. The Freedmen's Savings Bank never recovered. And the bond market, born in that chaos, shaped by those failures, regulated by those crises, never stopped growing. It stands today at $123 trillion. Built on the bones of railroads. Financed by promises. Guaranteed in the end by the public. The same public that was never quite sure what they were buying. And never quite stopped buying it.